Hello, friends, and welcome back. This is part 4 of the Space Between series, in which we are exploring the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. You'll remember that last week we ended with Alexander the Great, and things didn't go so well for him after he conquered much of the Mediterranean world. He died at 32, 33 years old, somewhere in there. And immediately, because he had no son, there was this crisis of succession. And so all of these generals and relatives fought over control and sliced up his empire into all of these little pieces like a butcher with a cow. And so from this point on, we're going to talk about a number of different empires that were in control of the land of Judah. And we're going to be talking about primarily the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids up in the area of Babylon and further out. Now, it's hard to remember, but, try to keep in mind, when I talk about Egypt, in this case, we're not talking about the Egypt of the pharaohs and the indigenous peoples of Africa. At this point, we're talking about Greeks that had taken over Egypt and had melded together the native philosophies and religions and practices with their Hellenistic ways. So Ptolemy and them mesh together, and it creates this Ptolemaic Egyptian culture that's pretty unique. Meanwhile, the Seleucids kind of do the same thing out there with Babylonian culture, but we'll get to them next week. Because after the dust settles, we end up with Ptolemaic control over Judah, which seems appropriate, right? I mean, the Jewish people and the Egyptians have a long history of back and forth of conquering and being conquered, of lots of things we didn't even talk about because there's not time. And so in this period, this roughly 100-year period between 300 and 200 BC, life basically continued as usual for the people in Judah. See, they were in the hill countries, and the Ptolemies didn't really care much about them. They focused mostly on the coastal cities and that trade route that went up along the coast. So they kind of just left the hill people to themselves. And the only thing that really changed in this time in their day-to-day life was that the high priest would be writing a check to the Ptolemies instead of the Persians once a year for their tribute. But there are two things that start to blossom in this time that will really come to fruit in a little while. And that being this mass exodus of Jews from Judah into Egypt, back into Egypt, specifically into Alexandria, and all of the intermixing of ideas and worldviews and cultures that would happen there. And also the beginning of a new system of taxation, which I know, right, sounds thrilling, but actually helps to illuminate a lot of the New Testament. So first, let's talk about Alexandria. Alexandria was one of dozens of cities that Alexander founded and named after himself. Not really a humble man. But this was probably the greatest. This was the center and the capital of the Ptolemaic Egypt. Ptolemy himself had rerouted the funeral procession of Alexander and brought his body into Alexandria, where it stayed for a couple hundred years. Ptolemy II, his son, built the Library of Alexandria, which is... There are some days where I'll remember that the Library of Alexandria burned down, and I'll legitimately get sad thinking about all of the documents that we lost in that horrible fire. This was the greatest library ever conceived to that point. The goal of this library was to gather every single document from every single country within the whole Greco area, not really Greco-Roman, the whole known world, as it were, and to have their librarians and their scholars study the books, the holy text, the science, the mathematics, the art from every corner of the world and bring them into one central place. And they did, and they poured tons of money into research and into building and into transcribing and copying. And my goodness, the amount of science that came out of this era is just mesmerizing. And this is when Euclid, who was one of the librarians, invents geometry and basically writes the mathematics textbook that we would use until maybe 100 years ago. This is when Aristarchus first proposed that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. I mean, that idea wouldn't come back until Copernicus. This is also when Eratosthenes, I got to make sure I get the pronunciation right in case there are any ancient Greeks watching. Eratosthenes proved, using a well and a shadow and a stick, that the earth was round and not flat. He was able to, within a very small margin of error, calculate the entire circumference of the globe. He calculated the distance to the sun, the distance to the moon. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's coming out of Alexandria during this time. Just the sort of stuff that would inspire the Renaissance when it got rediscovered thousands of years later. And this library, by bringing together all of these diverse ideas from across the empire, did what always happens when cultures collide. It creates something amazing. Speaking of, like I said earlier, there's a sizable population of Jews from Judah who begin to move into Alexandria. So many, in fact, that they were given their own Jewish quarter within the city of Alexandria, and a really nice part of town, too. And they were allowed to have their own ethnarch, which is like a local ruler over a group of ethnically similar people. So they were allowed to be fairly autonomous within the city because the Alexandrians knew, like, well, they've got all these rules. We have no idea what they are. So let them rule themselves. They established 71 elders, a local court system. They were really important in the city. They would be later really important in the military. Here, they were really important in the financial systems of Alexandria, as well as a lot of other industries. And as the Jewish population in Alexandria began to grow, they started to feel like they were like another Jerusalem, and that they were mostly Greek speakers, and they were so far separated from the reality of Judah that they needed their own Bible. And so they wrote a Bible. Well, they translated a Bible, their Bible. There's a legend that goes along with this that is most definitely not true, but is a lot of fun. And the legend goes that Ptolemy II wanted a Hebrew Bible to complete the library in Alexandria because he was collecting holy texts from all over. But the Jewish people in the area wanted to make sure that it was perfect. And so they hired 70 scribes, and each and every one of them went into isolation for I forget how long to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And when they compared the results, all 70 copies were word for word identical. And so they knew that the Septuagint, the Greek translation, was as divinely inspired and reliable as the Hebrew Bible. That's the story. It is entirely false. And I can say that pretty reliably because it's not a great translation by modern translation standards. It makes a lot of grammatical mistakes. There's a lot of little issues here and there with the word choices. And, that's fine. That's not a knock against it. It's totally fine because the Bible doesn't have to be grammatically perfect to be the Bible. Right? I mean, how many English translations do we have? And each and every one of them chooses the words that they choose for a different reason, and that's great. It helps us to get deeper into the meaning and not get caught up on the little things. So what if the writer of the Septuagint didn't know what this wild ox was that was in ancient Israel? And so he translated the Hebrew word to unicorn. And now in the King James, there are unicorns in the book of Psalms. But what does it matter, right? The point is, we had a new translation of the Bible. For the first time, literally ever, the Bible had been translated into Greek. And this Bible became the primary Bible used by people around the Jewish diaspora. So not just in Alexandria, but in Babylon and in parts of Judah. In fact, whenever the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, they're using the Septuagint Greek and not their own translation of it. When the early church fathers quote the Old Testament, they're quoting the Septuagint. When Jesus was quoting, he was probably quoting from the Septuagint. This is a pretty big deal, this document. And this Septuagint not only included what we would now call the Hebrew Bible, but there are other books in it too. The books of Maccabees, of Tobit, of Baruch, Wisdom of Sirach, and a couple others. These are books that are written in Greek during this time period that Jewish people in the various places viewed as scripture. And so it made it into the Greek scripture. And so this is what the Catholics would call the apocrypha. These books that are in the Septuagint, but not the Hebrew scripture. And when the Protestant Reformation happened, Martin Luther wanted nothing to do with the Septuagint. He wanted to go straight from the Hebrew. So that's why our Bibles don't include those books in it, because our Bibles, the Protestant Bibles, were translated without looking at that first Greek translation. But that first Greek translation was kind of a big deal. And not just for those reasons, but also because now the people got their hands on a Bible written in the common language that was understandable for the common person. And now that they had their own Bible, the Jews in Alexandria built the very first synagogue. This was a centralized place of study and of scriptural reading. These are not places of worship like they are today. It's a later development after the temple was destroyed. These are primarily places of scripture reading, of teaching, of preaching, of learning, of debate and discussion of the Torah and the rest of what's contained in the Bible. So if you think about our text from a few weeks ago where Jesus stands up in the synagogue and reads from Isaiah, or later when the religious leaders ask him where his authority to teach comes from. Yeah. Translating the Bible into the common tongue established these local centers of Jewish study, of religious study and identity. These local centers that were controlled by the local teachers. And this democratization of the Jewish religion starts moving the power from the priests only out to the people and the leaders of the people, the religious leaders of the people. And that's going to kind of be a big issue in a couple weeks. But before we get to that, how on earth did Ptolemy pay for all this? This is all pretty expensive. How do you afford it? Well, the answer comes from recently discovered cache of letters from a man named Zenon, who was the finance minister's secretary under Ptolemy II. He got a lot of these letters, and they're really mundane letters about tax and finance from the land of Palestine. But what it shows us is the introduction of this new method of collecting revenue from the conquered peoples called tax farming. Basically what happened was the Ptolemaic government would estimate the total annual tax based on census data and the previous year's taxes of a specific region, and then they would auction the rights to collect those taxes to local tax collectors, anyone who could afford to pay the taxes outright. So then the winner would pay the entire sum of taxes to the Ptolemies, and then collect the taxes from the people, and then they would be allowed to keep whatever exceeded the estimation from the government, which of course incentivized them to overcharge people, to cover their own butts. It's just an insurance policy. Also, it's a really smart system from the Ptolemies' perspective because they know that people are inherently greedy. And when you give them this system where they are kind of free to exploit people who have no power to fight back, then they're going to do it. And so they're relying on the people and the tax collectors' greed in order to make sure that they receive the revenue that they need. And it worked. It worked extremely well. One particular family, a man by the name of Tobias and his son Joseph, used the wealth that they already had to assemble a tax monopoly over the land of Judah, and they became obscenely rich off of the backs of their own people. So this system created a new economic caste in Judah, the tax collector. These were wealthy people who got wealthier off of the backs of their fellow Jews in service of foreign nations. So they kind of sound like the slave drivers in the book of Exodus. And everyone knew that these men were cheats and they were scoundrels and they were always skimming money off the top, but there was nothing they could do to stop this from happening. They had no records. Most of these peasants couldn't read, let alone get the Ptolemy's ear. So you just had to grin and bear it and just get cheated and robbed blind by your own people, right? That level of betrayal in there, I think, is pretty important. So by the time that we meet the tax collectors in the New Testament, of which there are several, one of them being a disciple of Jesus, these men aren't just like IRS workers like you'd think of them today. These were men who were actively getting filthy rich off of their neighbors in order to fund the opulence of foreign rulers that were oppressing them. This is not a great look for a people whose origin story is literally about breaking out of slavery. So in summary, in this time period, Alexandria joins Jerusalem and Babylon as major Jewish centers of thought and of population and of influence. The Alexandrian Jews made a Bible for the people and started creating institutions to teach the population and to democratize their religion. And this is wonderful for them. It's all great, but there's also a lot of Greek values and philosophical ideas in there too, and that becomes a problem next week. And then to pay for all this expansion, the Greeks created a middleman to collect their taxes from the people directly and not just from the leaders. And this created a new class of super wealthy people that are generally reviled by everyone for reinforcing their own forced subjugation. And as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the upper class becomes more Greek, and the lower class cling to their ancestral nationalistic beliefs, could this bifurcation of society become problematic? Yes. But not until next week. I'll see you then.